as that sort of really cheap money comes out, the tech stocks are a beautiful thing. They are growth. They are all about the future, etc. But they tend to be doing that on an idea of earnings in the future. And that's certainly what the NASDAQ has been doing. It's been growing on earnings in the future with really cheap money. And the question now is as rates go up, is the risk that comes with that future earnings at risk? And also the fact that the NASDAQ over the last year and a half is up almost 60%. So all those factors, taking some profit, worried about the future of whether or not the earnings can be met, and also higher rates, all probably contribute to why tech stocks fell today.
So what's this been, therefore, our worst day for some time?
It is. So it's the worst day we've seen since February last year. It's not the worst start to a year that we've seen in the last 5 years, though. So if you go back to 2015-16, the end of December, start of January 2016, there was a bigger fall, and that's when the Chinese were experimenting with having all sorts of different mechanisms to try and safeguard their market. It ended up backfiring and hurt a lot. So it hasn't been as bad as 2016, but we are now, in a very, very short period of time, 3 trading days, down about 2% for the year to date.
Happy New Year. Evan, thanks very much. Evan Lucas of InvestSmart talking to us on the day. The ASX 200 lost 207 points to close at 7,358. Even the dollar's down by about 0.6% against the greenback, trading at 71 3/4 US.
Tap into what's happening here and around the world. ABC News Radio. News you can rely on.
We need to deepen communication and cooperation. I think we all knew this was coming.
We are seeing job losses in this industry.
Australia's only national 24-hour radio news network.
Both remain in custody.
Effort must be made to diversify the nation's export market.
It's a tough but fair measure.
ABC News Radio.
Independent, trusted, up-to-the-minute news coverage.
Let's bring you right up to date with what's happening in sport, in particular at the SCG. Brianna Holden's back. The Australian captain's out, but we've had a pretty good day, Bri.
We certainly have. A century from Usman Khawaja has propelled Australia into a commanding position as we sit 7-4, 336 after play has just resumed from tee on day 2 of the 4th Ashes Test. Khawaja and Smith combined for 115 for the 4th wicket before Smith fell to Stuart Broad. Broad then removed Cameron Green for 5 and Alex Carey for 13. Australia went into tee at 6 for 321. But as we said, Pat Cummins has recently been dismissed at 424, so Mitchell Starc now joins Khawaja at the crease. In tennis, a court challenge against the detention of tennis star Novak Djokovic is being launched to see if he will be able to play in the Australian Open. Jetta Costa has more.
Lawyers for Novak Djokovic have launched a federal circuit court challenge over the federal government's decision to deport the world number 1 tennis player from Australia after his visa was cancelled this morning. A brief hearing at 3 o'clock this afternoon was adjourned for an hour, and he's expected to file an application and affidavit. Among the considerations discussed was whether he can be moved to a hotel with a tennis court and whether the matter of his detention and visa will be decided before the Australian Open starts on January the 17th. Djokovic was detained when he arrived at Melbourne Airport just before midnight.
And sticking with that story, where the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has denied that Djokovic was singled out over his vaccination status. Morrison says Djokovic was unable to prove he was medically exempt from being vaccinated against COVID-19.
This is not an irregular thing to happen if someone is put on a plane and told to return to their country, even if they may have come with a valid visa. People are welcome in Australia, but if you're not double vaccinated and you're not an Australian resident or citizen, well, you can't come.
Sticking with tennis, and Ash Barty and Storm Sanders have scored a walkover win in their doubles rubber at the Adelaide International. The Australian pairing were due to play Kiwi Erin Rutliff and Canadian Leylah Fernandez, but will go straight through to the semi-finals. In the men's draw, American Steve Johnson trails Russian Karen Khachanov a set to love. Earlier, American Tommy Paul defeated Japan's Taro Daniel in 3 sets. To mixed martial arts now, and UFC featherweight champion Alexander Volkanovski will fight former champion Max Holloway in a trilogy bout as the Australian looks to defend his title for a third time. Wollongong-based Volkanovski originally defeated Holloway in 2019 to clinch the title before defending against the American 6 months later. He also beat Brian Ortega in September last year. Holloway is widely considered the sport's greatest featherweight champion. In netball, the Australian Diamonds have come together for the first time in months as they prepare for the Quad Series in London. The Diamonds will play England, New Zealand and South Africa from January 16 to 20, with the tournament going ahead despite increases in COVID-19 cases internationally. Australian Diamonds head coach Stacey Marinkovic says there will be rigorous testing in place to protect all athletes involved.
We're put into a bubble and we're not mixing with other teams. We've got our own floor at the hotel and it's will be ships passing in the night, except for when we actually hit the court against each other.
The basketball and 10 Tasmania Jack Jumper players and coaching staff have now tested positive to COVID-19. The team is unable to meet the minimum requirements for a team under NBL protocols, meaning its 2 games in round 6 will both be postponed. All players and performance staff are now isolating and will undergo testing. It's unclear when the games will be held. And finishing with soccer, Melbourne Victory has eliminated defending champion Adelaide United from the FFA Cup, winning the quarterfinal 2-1. The visitors fought back from a goal down after a first-half Craig Goodwin free kick, with a late Francesco Magriotta penalty proving decisive. Elsewhere, Wellington beat Melbourne City on penalties after the match finished 0-0. Back to you, Glenn.
Thank you very much. Brianna Holden, bring us up to date with sport. You heard the bad news on the finance front. The Australian share market losing 2.7% today. We're not alone. The Nikkei in Japan down exactly that amount as well, 2.7%. And the dollar falling too, as I say. Let's have a look at what Thursday's weather's doing. And there's a bit of shower activity around the capitals, including in Brisbane, which has hit the top temperature of 28 degrees. Sydney expecting 28, close to it now too, with a shower or two. There certainly was some this morning. Let's see how we go from here. Canberra, showers and maybe a storm, currently 23 degrees. 25 in Melbourne on what is a humid day and possibly a storm for you as well. The rain increasing in Hobart, even if the temperature isn't much, it's stuck on about 16. 20 in Adelaide with a shower or two for you. But sunny and warm in Perth, 34 heading to 35 degrees. Darwin on 32 with some showers and maybe a storm as well. The next ABC News update coming up now. It's 4:30 Eastern Daylight Time. South Australia at 4 p.m, 3:30 in Queensland makes it 3 o'clock in the Northern Territory, and now 1:30 for you listening in Perth and across Western Australia.
ABC News, I'm Clive Hunton. A court's challenge against the detention of tennis star Novak Djokovic and the cancellation of his visa is being launched in the Federal Circuit and Family Court. A brief hearing has been adjourned for him to file an application and affidavit. The court heard considerations including whether or not Djokovic can be moved to a hotel with a tennis court, and if his visa status will be decided before the Australian Open starts. Djokovic was detained when he arrived at Melbourne Airport just before midnight. The Northern Territory government says it won't adopt a change to testing rules determined at the most recent meeting of National Cabinet. The nation's leaders yesterday agreed that a PCR test would no longer be required to confirm positive rapid antigen tests, amid huge testing demand around the country. But Chief Minister Michael Gunner says Territorians who return positive rapid antigen tests are still required to get a follow-up PCR, because the local health system can handle it.
Down south, the PCR testing system is broken. In the Northern Territory, over 70% of PCRs are back in under 24 hours. A positive PCR keeps us confident in our caseload and control of our case numbers.
The Victorian government has announced major changes to its COVID testing system in a bid to ease pressure on pathology centres. From tomorrow, those who test positive on a rapid antigen test must report the results by phone or online to the health department. They'll then be included in the state's daily official figures. Acting Chief Health Officer Ben Cowie says the move is the biggest change to the testing system since the start of the pandemic.
The number of people that our PCR testing system diagnosed yesterday was greater than the number diagnosed for the entire of 2020, and it's likely that in the first 10 days of this year, our testing system will diagnose more people than it did all of 2021.
The New South Wales opposition says positive rapid tests should be reported to health authorities to ensure outbreaks are properly monitored. Comes after the National Cabinet decision to remove the requirement for people with a positive test to get a PCR one. Labor leader Chris Minns says better reporting will help protect hospital systems.
Now, we expect rising case numbers right across New South Wales, but New South Wales Health will still need to deploy nurses, doctors and frontline technicians to areas that have the highest number of cases.
Western Australia has recorded one new local case of COVID-19. The case is in quarantine and is not related to WA's ongoing Delta cluster. Authorities continue to investigate how 2 hotel quarantine security guards who have tested positive to COVID-19 caught the virus. Thailand has raised its COVID-19 alert level after a rapid rise in Omicron cases there. Southeast Asia correspondent Mazoe Ford reports.
COVID-19 infections are rising steeply again in Thailand, with almost 6,000 new cases today, up almost 50% from yesterday. The numbers are just those taken from PCR tests. Rapid antigen test results aren't included. Health officials have declared this Thailand's 5th wave of the pandemic, but reassured people there are plenty of hospital beds for those who need them. They've asked people to work from home, avoid travel, limit the number of people at gatherings and avoid indoor restaurants. Mazoe Ford, ABC News, Bangkok.
The brother of notorious gang leader Bassam Hamzi has been shot dead in Sydney's west. ABC sources say Gassam Amoon was shot several times. Police were called to South Wentworthville this afternoon after reports a man had been found injured in a car. Acting Superintendent Glenn Fitzgerald says clearly it was a targeted shooting.
Any type of incident like this is a worry. This is what happens when firearms are in possession of the wrong people. So all I can do is give the undertaking that there is a significant investigation. There has been for some time, and there will be police on the streets door knocking a lot of premises as this goes on.
Emergency services are working out how to rescue 2 people whose 4-wheel drive is reportedly teetering on a cliff edge in Victoria's west. The SES says the pair was travelling in the west of the Grampians National Park this afternoon when they ran off a remote and unsafe track. The SES is also urging people to stay away from the Grampians and tourists who are already there to stay indoors with 100 millimetres of rain forecast for the area in the coming hours. This morning, volunteers responded to 100 calls for assistance in Ballarat and Creswick after the area recorded 200 millimetres. And just updating the cricket, Australia now 7 for 343. ABC News.
You're listening to ABC News Radio.
Thanks for being with us. Hi, I'm Glenn Bartholomew. Coming up, new restrictions for the Northern Territory as COVID numbers climb. Yet another gangland shooting in Sydney. And rat cunning, the website developer helping people find those elusive rapid antigen tests. Fine and sunny in Perth, but showers or rain about in the other capitals and possible storms in Darwin, Canberra and Melbourne. Speaking of Darwin, a lockout has been imposed across the Northern Territory, which is experiencing an unprecedented surge in new COVID-19 infections. They're high numbers by the Territory standards. Another 256 COVID cases detected in the latest reporting period, including 27 cases of presumed community transmission. Now, under this lockout, unvaccinated people will only be allowed to leave their homes for 3 reasons. They are medical treatment, getting essential goods and services, and providing care. No mention of exercise or the need to go to work. To get reaction from the business community in the top end, we're joined by Greg Ireland, the CEO of the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce. Thanks for your time. This can't be good news.
Yeah, hi Glenn, and thanks for the opportunity to catch up. From a Territory perspective, we've seen a number of these lockout situations before, and we've also had vaccination mandates employed by the Chief Health Officer. So the majority of our workforce is vaccinated and has been complying with that requirement since Christmas time. So it's not a big change for many businesses out there, but it's certainly one that is concerning when we look at the trends of community transmission that's occurring up here now.
Yeah, so unvaccinated people wouldn't be able to go to work, but as you say, hopefully that's not too many. Do we have any idea what sort of percentage we're talking about that haven't got the jab?
Yeah, it's difficult to say for sure. I believe it's somewhere between 5 and 10% that are pretty keen not to be vaccinated. Obviously, that's a personal choice for them, but since the 24th of December, it's been a requirement to be double vaccinated to work in a contact environment.
So what will it mean for those people and their employers?
It's not going to change things substantially. It's kind of business as usual from what we've been doing for the last few weeks. What is going to change, I guess, is people's general freedoms with respect to not going out and doing any exercise and not being able to get out for any other reason than essential activities.
But what, they work from home or what?
Yeah, a lot of people are working from home, so that's some of those people that aren't in that vaccination category are able to work from home if their employers are able to facilitate that. But and that's been the case for some weeks. But the reality is that as this situation evolves, I think there'll be more and more pressure on people to be vaccinated.
This might be one of those times that persuades people to do so.
Well, it's I guess, pointing in that direction, isn't it, Glenn? Encouragement to, if you want to participate, then that's going to be one of the requirements. But obviously still remains a personal choice.
Do you know if there's a distinction for essential workers, or are they all supposed to be vaccinated by now?
My understanding is that everyone's supposed to be vaccinated to participate anywhere that you may come across a vulnerable component of the community.
This is notionally until Monday as some sort of circuit breaker. You wouldn't like it to go for too much longer?
Well, preferably not. We're already under a mask mandate and that's continuing. So we would like to see the numbers reducing, but I guess if we look at the trends that's happening on the eastern seaboard and other locations, it's certainly potentially not going to be the case.
Were you consulted on this? Were you warned in advance it was coming?
No, I wasn't. I did get some early indication today that these were the outcomes. Obviously, that's dependent on the overnight figures, which makes it difficult for them to give us much notice.
Do you fear there could be any tougher restrictions coming down the track?
Look, I would hope not. The conversations I've had with government to date mean that they are really looking to exercise lockout as the worst case scenario. But I think if the numbers continue to climb, everything's on the table. So we're very, very keen to make sure that business has continuity and we don't want to see things like density restrictions put in place. And that'll be obviously a decision for the Chief Health Officer in due course.
I see the Territory Government also not going to adopt that change to testing rules that was decided at the recent National Cabinet meeting. So Territorians who return any positive rapid antigen test will still be required to get a follow-up PCR test. Is that the right way to go?
Yeah, look, it's I noticed that one too, and obviously they seem to consider that the PCR test gives that little bit more level of comfort in knowing what their numbers are. I guess when we're talking the case numbers that we are at the moment, many of them in isolation anyway, it's probably a reasonable thing at this point to make sure that the data is as accurate as possible.
How well placed is the Territory as far as access to those rapid antigen tests is concerned?
Well, we have a number of testing facilities. I'm not quite sure of their throughput capability, but certainly I would hope that we can cope with what we've got at the moment. But again, those are things that are going to be factoring into some of those decisions in the future, aren't they?
Sounds like it. Greg Ireland, thanks for talking to us.
You're welcome.
The CEO of the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce, where things are changing a little on the Territory front with that 3-day or other several-day lockout through till Monday being announced by the Territory Government today. Speaking of those rapid tests, there's been a bit of a frenzy across much of the country trying to find rapid antigen tests, supplies running out at pharmacies and supermarkets and people travelling some vast distances to obtain them. A Melbourne software developer created a website to help people find such test kits, and it's fast gained popularity across other parts of the country. Our reporter Gavin Coote spoke with a few Sydney-siders outside a pharmacy who used that website to get their hands on a rapid test kit.
I live in Cammeray, so I've been to one stop already at Chatswood and then now here to Hunters Hill. I called ahead, but they couldn't obviously put them aside. But it's creating an amazing frenzy and it's probably not good for all of our health.
How are you going for supplies at home? Have you run out completely?
This is my first time ever, so yeah, I've been doing PCR tests, but of course now with all of the changing rules or whatever, this is the best way. But a girlfriend has been diagnosed this morning and she's had a PCR, so it's just going everywhere. My son's got it, yeah.
Did you ever imagine you'd be spending, I guess, the summer racing around trying to get a rat?
Not at all, not at all. So, yeah, and it's also confusing. I suppose, every day it changes, so who knows what's got to happen tomorrow.
You've had to not only go outside your suburb, well and truly, but use some pretty innovative methods to find where to go.
Absolutely. I think thank heavens for that website. It was very good, yeah.
Well, and you've got a couple now.
I do. I've got 4 now, so fingers crossed.
Yes, I've just been somewhere else and they sold out before I could get there.
Was there a queue when you got there?
No, there wasn't. But I need them because my daughter's actually having surgery and it's a requirement of the private hospital that she have 4 tests prior to the surgery. So that's why I'm desperate to get them.
And were you one of the ones that kind of had the foresight to at least stock up before Christmas, or were you sort of already working from zero supplies at home?
We stocked up enough before Christmas to test everyone for Christmas Day, but I didn't get extras. It seemed expensive at the time then, and now, of course, the price has gone up, which is disappointing.
Was this one reasonably priced, the ones you got?
It was 2 for $30, so that's an increase of $5 per test since Christmas.
How'd you know where to go to get a rat?
There's a link. Find a rapid antigen test.
And it seems to be accurate in this case.
Yes, it is.
And they're pretty happy about that. Some Sydney-siders speaking from outside a pharmacy with Gavin Coote about the rat run, the desperate search for some rapid antigen tests. Let's stay in that part of the country because the brother of notorious gang leader Bassam Hamzi has been shot dead in Western Sydney. Investigative sources say Ghassan Amoun was shot multiple times in South Wentworthville around 1 p.m. local time about 5 hours ago. A car was found nearby. It's believed to be linked to the attack. The death of Amoun follows the fatal shootings of his brother, Mejid Hamzi, at Condell Park in 2020, and cousin Bilal Hamzi outside a Japanese restaurant in Sydney's CBD last year. Acting Superintendent for New South Wales Police Glenn Fitzgerald gave this update a little earlier.
About 12:45 p.m. today, police and emergency services were called to Rawson Street at South Wentworthville across the Great Western Highway. Police were called there due to a shooting. Upon arrival, ambulance officers attempted to resuscitate, however the man died at the scene. Described as a 35-year-old male. The shooting is quite obviously targeted. Obvious connections to criminal networks are underway as far as investigations. Cumberland Police are investigating and have the assistance of both homicide and state crime criminal groups. Any type of incident like this is a worry. This is what happens when firearms are in possession of the wrong people. So all I can do is give the undertaking that there is a significant investigation. There has been for some time, and there will be police on the streets door knocking a lot of premises as this goes on.
That's the latest from Sydney Police. They've had a few of these shootings to cover in recent months. New South Wales Police Acting Superintendent Glenn Fitzgerald giving the latest information there. You're with ABC News Radio and it's 4:45 Eastern Daylight Time. South Australia now 4:04 and 4:04 in Queensland, 3:15 in the Northern Territory. Time in the West is 1:45. And making news, a court challenge against the detention of tennis star Novak Djokovic and the cancellation of his visa has been launched in the Federal Circuit and Family Court. Djokovic was detained when he arrived at Melbourne Airport just before midnight after Border Force determined he didn't meet the entry requirements for a visa. The Victorian government has announced major changes to its COVID testing system in a bid to ease pressure on pathology centres. From tomorrow, those who test positive on a rapid antigen test must report the results by phone or online to the Health Department. And the Northern Territory government says it will not adopt a change to testing rules determined at the most recent meeting of National Cabinet. Chief Minister Michael Gunner saying Territorians who return positive rapid antigen tests are still required to get a follow-up PCR test because the local health system can handle it. Well, let's get some better medical news, shall we? Scientists in the UK have developed a new type of blood test that can detect a range of cancers and whether those cancers have spread around the body. Details of the study by Oxford University have been published in the journal Clinical Cancer Research. It involved 300 patients with symptoms that may indicate a tumour, such as weight loss or fatigue. Dr. James Larkin is one of the researchers from Oxford University and explains just how this blood test works.
It works using a blood sample. We take a blood sample from a patient that we suspect has a cancer, and we analyse that sample. We use a technique called nuclear magnetic resonance. It is a technique that uses radio waves and high field magnets. The way I like to think about it is it's like listening to tuning forks, and you can hear particular frequencies, particular sounds with tuning forks, and we look for particular sounds effectively off the molecules that we're looking at, and we turn that into a profile of small molecules in the blood. And then we look for these small molecules and look for particular patterns, and we identify which patients have cancer based on those patterns.
And what exactly does it tell you beyond that? Does it simply tell you whether someone is suffering from cancer, or can it pinpoint particular cancers?
So at the moment, what we are confident with is that we can both find a cancer and we can tell whether or not that cancer has spread. We have lots of promising data that we may be able to tell apart particular types of tumours, but at the moment we don't have enough confidence that we can say that for certainty.
And how accurate is it in terms of picking up cancer generally?
Our overall accuracy is 88%. The sensitivity is 94%. So we will find 94 cancers out of 100 if patients come through with this test.
And what's different to other similar blood tests? It's something we reported on a few months ago, a trial in the National Health Service looking at a blood test that picks up cancers in a similar fashion. What's different about this test? What is it that you're picking up in this blood test that other tests are looking for?
So I think I know which test you're referring to. That particular one looks for DNA. It looks for genetic material that has been released by tumours into the bloodstream, and it looks for that. We're not looking at DNA at all. We're instead looking at these small molecules, which are called metabolites, like glucose or lactic acid. These molecules, they can come from the tumour directly, but they can also come from the rest of the body as it responds to the fact that there's a tumour present. So we get an amplification of our signal that we can see the tumour more sensitively. This is an incredibly important area for successful cancer treatment. You need early cancer diagnosis, and it's great that there are lots of potential different approaches being tried.
Can you imagine a situation where people were perhaps not just having one test, but different types of tests?
Absolutely, and it depends on the patient's profile. So we're looking, for example, at patients who have non-specific symptoms, so people who are, say, fatigued or they've lost weight, but they don't have a particular indication of cancer. And our test is very good in that population of patients. And it might be that our test remains the test of choice for particular populations, and that other technologies work in other populations as well.
Can you imagine this being routine? Is it pretty quick? Is it inexpensive?
Absolutely. It's relatively inexpensive, and the actual test itself is quite quick. There's obviously all the logistics about how you'd move blood from say, the GP, primary care doctors, or to an analysis centre. But once you get it to the analysis centre, the test itself is very quick.
And what's the sort of timescale involved? I mean, several years, is it?
We're looking for about 2 years for our next trial. It depends how quickly we can raise funding, and it depends how quickly regulators work with us. So it's difficult to know, but I'd like to see it in the clinic within 5 years.
Wouldn't we all, by the sounds of it? Dr. James Larkin, one of the researchers from Oxford University, developing that new type of blood test that could help detect a range of cancers and how far they've spread. Just part of the scientific developments, perhaps, for the new year. Let's look at what we can expect from science in 2022. Mega rockets launched into space, the next big climate summit in Egypt, and the most advanced images of the universe are expected to be released. Let's get all of those details from science editor Rebecca Morell of the BBC.
5, 4,
3, 2, 1, 0. We have liftoff.
2022 is a big year for space, and we should see the launch of 2 mega rockets as America prepares to take astronauts back to the moon and beyond. There's Starship from SpaceX. At 120 metres high, it's the tallest rocket ever built, and it will attempt to fly around the Earth. Then there's NASA's ultra-powerful Space Launch System, which will blast off and send a crew capsule called Orion into orbit. No people will be on board for either of these test flights, but if they're a success, astronauts could soon be taking a ride.
Hearing no objections, it is so decided.
This was the moment a deal was reached at November's climate summit in Glasgow. The world had agreed to try and limit global warming, but it was clear that plans to cut emissions didn't go far enough. Alok Sharma was the president of COP26.
We can say with credibility that we have kept 1.5 degrees within reach, but its pulse is weak.
So 2022 will be another critical year for climate change. Nations will be meeting again, this time in Egypt, for COP27, and they've been asked to return with much more ambitious pledges. The question is, will this be enough to stop global temperatures from rising over 1.5 degrees, the threshold beyond which we see the dangerous impacts of climate change?
I think we have a success today. We have a discovery. We have discovered a new particle, a boson. Most probably a Higgs boson, but we have to find out which kind of Higgs boson this is.
And remember this, the announcement of the discovery of the Higgs boson in 2012. It was found by the Large Hadron Collider, the world's most powerful particle accelerator, and its discovery of the Higgs and dozens of other subatomic particles have changed our understanding of physics. But for the last 3 years, it's not been operating. The shutdown was planned to undertake vital repairs and upgrade work, but the pandemic meant it's taken longer than expected. This year, though, the collider will be switched on again to start the next phase of its experiments. And the UK's new polar research ship has now arrived in Antarctica, and soon it will be undergoing trials to see how it copes with the thick ice. The vessel, which was almost called Boaty McBoatface after a public vote, is now named after the British naturalist Sir David Attenborough. He's even recorded a special message for when it sets sail.
Your attention, please. Any personnel on board not sailing with the vessel, please disembark.
The unmistakable voice of Sir David Attenborough. I'll never forget Boaty McBoatface. The BBC's science editor, Rebecca Morell, on some of the things we can expect from the new year. Right, let's bring you up to date with sport. Watching the cricket and other sporting news for us, here's Brianna Holden and is back with the latest.
Well, Australia are 7 for 367 on day 2 of the 4th Ashes Test. Steve Smith and Usman Khawaja started the day at the crease after the tourists claimed the scalps of David Warner for 30, Marcus Harris for 38 and world number 1 Test batter Marnus Labuschagne for 28 yesterday. Both Australian batters survived the first session on day 2, but Khawaja only just dropped in at the 71st over, and after lunch it was Vice-Captain Steve Smith's turn for a near miss.
Oh, is that hitting leg stump? That's close. New ball, seam, bounce. They've reviewed. I think this is close. Pitching outside off, impact in line, and wickets is missing. We'll get you to stay with the original decision of 9 outs. That's a lot closer than what I thought it was straight away.
I didn't think it was that close, but I thought it was missing.
He survived that, but Smith's runs were numbered, headed to the shed just a few deliveries later.
Oh, there it is, beautifully bowled. Stuart Broad picks up Steve Smith. That's what England need.
Excellent delivery, and it was just made Stephen Smith drawn into the shot. He just followed. He probably could have let it go if he looks at it again, but it's a good bit of bowling. This new ball is doing enough to worry the batsman on this second day.
Smith gone for 67, and from there, Australia's middle order looked shaky, with his replacement Cameron Green lasting just 14 deliveries.
This time he gets the catch, and this time there's no mistake.
Green goes cheaply again. Broad with a wicket. Crawley with another catch. And England working their way back into the Test match.
And Stuart Broad is on song here. He's taken that second new ball and he has bowled it in brilliant areas.
2 for 11 in the spell from Broad. Green goes cheaply once again for 5.
His replacement, Alex Carey, managing only slightly better, falling for 13 runs.
Oh, it's gone straight up. There's a man running back to settle underneath and holds onto it. Johnny Bairstow. That's a very good catch. Alex Carey tried to get it over to the deep mid-wicket region and they get their 6th.
Yeah, it's an excellent catch from Johnny Bairstow. The field was back. This was a tough catch and it was a big partnership was starting to develop. It's a really important one too.
With wickets falling all around him, Khawaja provided enough stability to mark his return to the Test side with a ton.
Whips it and whips it well. Khawaja, the comeback kid, comes back for 3. A 9th Test 100 for Usman Khawaja. Uzi's back and he's big and he's better than ever and pumped about it.
His good form wasn't rubbing off on new batting partner Pat Cummins, though, with the captain soon gone for 24 after tea.
Oh, that could be the glove. Shouts. That's close, I reckon. Oh, they've got to be going upstairs. It looked like off the glove. Keeper's gone up. Broad, well, he's always going to go up.
Yeah,
Joe
really.
Root. Okay, there's a spike. There's a spike in the next frame as it's gone past the glove. So it's just roll it backwards and forwards, please. So I need to go back to the on-field umpire. There's conclusive evidence the ball has hit the glove.
Now, Australia are currently 7 for 369. Usman Khawaja on 122 and Mitchell Starc on 17. And taking a quick look at the other major story today, a leading immigration law expert believes Novak Djokovic will have difficult time arguing his case in court. Professor Mary Crock from the University of Sydney says the world number 1 has limited rights at the moment.
What he has to achieve is an injunction to stop his removal from the country. He really has to show that he's got a case of some kind. And now he's got to argue that the person who cancelled his visa has made a legal error.
That is the latest sport. I'll be back in half an hour.
Good on you, Brianna. Thank you. Financially, the Australian stock market has suffered some heavy falls today, led down by technology stocks, just like on Wall Street overnight. And that's part of the reason for it. The Federal Reserve in the US suggesting they might be about to take the punch bowl away and talk about interest rates being on the rise in the months to come. So the Australian market lost at 207 points, 2.75% to 7,358. Other markets in the region, like Japan, have done exactly the same thing. Tomorrow's forecast coming up in a few minutes' time. Just one last look at Thursday sees Brisbane on 28 with some showers. Showers in Sydney on 27 and 23 in Canberra. Showers and maybe a storm too. It's been a humid day in Melbourne, just 25 degrees, but the chance of a storm. Rain increasing in Hobart, you're on 16 degrees. 20 in Adelaide with a shower or two. And 34 in Perth, a sunny day. You might get to 35. 32 in Darwin with showers and a possible storm. Coming up to 5 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time, that'll be 4:30 in Adelaide and 4 o'clock Brisbane time, 3:30 in Darwin and 2 o'clock in Perth. On ABC News Radio, time for 10 minutes of news.
ABC News, I'm Clive Hunton. A court challenge against the detention of tennis star Novak Djokovic is being launched to see if he'll be able to play in the Australian Open. Jenna Costa has more.
Lawyers for Novak Djokovic have launched a federal circuit court challenge over the federal government's decision to deport the world number 1 tennis player from Australia after his visa was cancelled this morning. A brief hearing at 3 o'clock this afternoon was adjourned and he's expected to file an application and affidavit. Among the considerations discussed was whether he can be moved to a hotel with a tennis court and whether the matter of his detention and visa will be decided before the Australian Open starts on January the 17th. Djokovic was detained when he arrived at Melbourne Airport just before midnight.
A leading immigration law expert believes Djokovic will have a difficult time arguing his case in court. Professor Mary Crock from the University of Sydney says the world number one has limited rights at the moment.
What he has to achieve is an injunction to stop his removal from the country. He really has to show that he's got a case of some kind. And now he's got to argue that the person who cancelled his visa has made a legal error.
States and territories are assessing how to log positive rapid antigen test results to keep track of growing case numbers. To take pressure off the health system, National Cabinet is amending testing rules so those with positive rapid tests no longer have to get a PCR test to confirm it. There are concerns that with fewer PCR tests, not all COVID cases will be known to authorities. But Prime Minister Scott Morrison says the supply shortage of rapid antigen tests means PCR tests will be the main source of test results over the next few weeks.
But that gives the states a couple of weeks to get this other system in place, and that's what I anticipate that would occur. That doesn't have to be the same in every state and territory. They have their own systems for doing that. I don't see the need to impose that on them. They can work that out.
Around the country, density limits being reintroduced in Victoria, and it'll be mandatory to report a positive rapid antigen test. There were just under 22,000 new cases and another 6 deaths in Victoria today, as Melissa Brown reports.
Those who test positive on a rat will be considered probable cases and must isolate for 7 days and notify their contacts. It'll also be mandatory to report the positive result to the Department of Health through an online form or by phone. There'll be indoor density limits of 1 person per 2 square metres for hospitality venues and entertainment venues. The announcement of the restrictions comes a fortnight after density limits and the closure of indoor dance floors were recommended by the Chief Health Officer. The government chose not to bring in those changes at the time, arguing their introduction could hurt businesses and potentially undermine public confidence in the government's pandemic response.
Elsewhere, South Australian Premier Stephen Marshall says preparations are underway to begin testing close contacts using rapid antigen tests rather than PCR ones. He says soon close contacts will receive 2 rapid antigen tests from SA Health to test themselves on day 1 and day 6. Mr Marshall says the new system will relieve pressure on testing clinics and pathology services.
The State Emergency Centre will be setting up collection points across South Australia. Huge logistical exercise. It is were some ago, but this is the appropriate response for part of
State today reporting just in South Australia's remote northwest. Local authorities have closed the lands, prohibiting entry or departure for anyone except essential workers. There are also restrictions on the sale of fuel and the withdrawal of cash to help limit movement. APY General Manager Richard King says people who tested positive were from the community of Amata.
We haven't got any indications from any other communities other than the one that's where these 2 cases were. But things seem to be progressing well. We're going to review it on Monday to see if we can open back up if we get on top of this outbreak.
The ACT has recorded 992 new cases overnight. That's the highest daily number since the pandemic began. 20 people are in hospital, including 2 in ICU on ventilators. And a Canberra man in his 20s with no underlying health conditions has died in a Sydney hospital. ABC News. Elsewhere, the Northern Territory has entered a lockout after 256 new COVID cases were detected. Under the lockout, unvaccinated people will only be allowed to leave their homes for medical treatment or getting essential goods and services and providing care. An Adelaide Hills paramedic says crews across the state are being stretched beyond their limits. Yesterday, 13 ambulances were off the roads due to a lack of available staff. The union claims exposure to COVID and worker burnout has contributed. Woodside paramedic Nick Brockhoff says the Mount Barker area was already struggling before borders reopened, and he says COVID-19 has drained ambulance stations across the state.
Since the borders opened on the 23rd of November, I'm
reasonably led to believe that we've had nearly 200 shifts that have been uncovered across the Adelaide Hills. That encompasses the volunteer stations that do a great job in supporting us, but they are stretched way too thin.
Another brother of gang leader Bassem Hamzy has been shot dead in Sydney's west. Sarah Hawke reports.
Police have cornered off streets around the crime scene on Rawson Road in South Wentworthville. Emergency services were called just before 1 p.m. after reports a man was injured in a car. He died at the scene. Sources have told the ABC Ghassan Amon was shot multiple times. Another crime scene has been set up in a nearby street where a burnt-out car was found. It's believed to be linked to the attack. The 35-year-old's death follows the fatal shootings of his brother Majid Hamzy in 2020 and cousin Bilal Hamzy outside a restaurant in Sydney's CBD last year.
In some crime news from elsewhere, South Australia police have declared the death of a 53-year-old woman on a houseboat in 2020 a major crime. The death of 53-year-old Angela Berrex was initially ruled as not suspicious, but police say new information has led them to believe she was murdered. Police say they have one suspect, but are investigating whether more people may have been involved. Her daughter, Kathleen Napper, has appealed to anyone with information to come forward.
The family loved Mum, and we do miss her dearly. And to think that someone was responsible for her death has taken the family by shock. Mum was a kind, loving and caring mother and grandparent who would do anything for her family.
The Northern Territory's government's Child Protection Agency has explained how confidential material ended up at a Darwin tip shop late last year. Jesse Thompson has more.
Sensitive information, including child protection data, was mistakenly dumped at the Darwin tip shop last October, triggering an internal government investigation. A spokeswoman from the Department of Territory Families has now confirmed the cabinets were disposed of by approved contractors during an office refurbishment. She said the agency has now implemented a range of checks and balances to prevent a repeat. No one's come forward to say they bought cabinets containing departmental information from the tip shop. The agency says it hasn't received any complaints under the Information Act.
Overseas, lawyers for convicted sex offender Ghislaine Maxwell have called for a fresh trial after comments were made to the media by a jury member. Tui Ong reports.
The juror has told media he used his own experience of being sexually abused to persuade other jurors who doubted witnesses. The prosecution has asked the trial judge to open an inquiry into that statement. Ghislaine Maxwell was found guilty in New York last month of grooming and trafficking young girls to be sexually abused by the late financier Jeffrey Epstein. The lawyer for the British socialite says it's incontrovertible grounds for a new trial and has called the matter an issue of pressing importance. Prosecutors say the jurors' statements to the media merit attention by the court.
The Australian Stock Exchange suffered heavy falls today, led down by tech stocks. David Taylor has more.
The US Federal Reserve has spooked global financial markets after indicating its first interest rate hike may come as soon as March. Ongoing supply constraints are pushing up the cost of goods and services and leading to higher inflation. It's the role of central banks to respond to rising inflation by raising interest rates. Record low interest rates have helped global stock markets achieve recent record highs. The Australian market today was dragged down by companies most sensitive to interest rates. By the close, the ASX 200 had fallen by 2.7% to 7,358.
People are fleeing their homes in Vanuatu after the government declared a danger zone around an active volcano. The Manarowi volcano is a well-known tourist site, but over the past 2 months, ash plumes have destroyed crops and contaminated water supplies. And briefly at the cricket, Australia now 7 for 380. Usman Khawaja still there. ABC News.
You're listening to ABC News Radio.
Hi, Glenn Bartholomew with you. It is Thursday, the 6th of January, and coming up, lay of the land, the COVID situation from Victoria to the Northern Territory and places in between. It's a grim picture. Australia's previously good record of COVID management could be fading into the distance as the cases rise. But don't panic is the message from retail groups who say shortages of fresh food in our supermarkets should only be temporary. Checking tomorrow's weather, and another very hot and sunny day in Perth and a fine day in Darwin, but showers or storms likely again in most of the other capitals. We'll have details for you in a little while. Well, are we entering a new phase of how we deal with this pandemic? It looks that way a little, with the unprecedented surge of new infections across the country, forcing some states and territories to reimpose restrictions. From midnight tonight, indoor hospitality venues in Victoria will be required to reintroduce density limits. And the Northern Territory has entered a lockout, meaning unvaccinated people are only allowed to leave their homes for 3 reasons until at least Monday. For more, and to discuss the COVID situation around the country, we're joined by Professor Catherine Bennett, the Chair of Epidemiology at Deakin University in Victoria. Professor, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Glenn.
Let's look in your home state to start with. Indoor density limits back in place. 1 person per 2 square metres in restaurants, cafes, pubs and nightclubs from midnight tonight. Did you expect this? What do you make of this move?
Well, we certainly have seen, as we've seen previously, most of the spread occurring in young adults. We also know that while rolling out our boosters is going to help us slow down the virus a bit, we're not there yet, particularly with younger adults. A lot of them aren't yet even at that 4-month interval mark. So this is really just trying to ease it off a bit, acknowledging that, you know, people mix differently. When you're young adults, you're out, you're in these kinds of multi-household settings with lots of other people. I think the Minister described it quite well today, talking about the sort of concentration of people, how actively they are mingling and that it's mobile. So targeting those areas particularly to try and just take some of the risk down a notch by not having as many people in one place will help, I think, keep the numbers from, you know, going that extra peak that we might be able to avoid. So we're not going to stop this. It is only about trying to slow it a bit, but it's probably a good time to do it because we're still seeing probably some of the aftermath of New Year, but we're still in that holiday season. So no doubt this kind of young adult mixing is still going to be the core group, if you like, that's driving a lot of the transmission in the state.
To another measure from tomorrow, those who test positive on a rapid antigen test in Victoria must report the results by phone or online to the health department. Is this kind of enforced at all, or is this an honesty system?
Well, I think it's an honesty system. One of the concerns in relying more on a rapid antigen test is they're not quite as accurate anyway, so you can miss cases. But I think there was concern that people might not be diagnosed or not covered by the system. So some of the financial cover you have if you test positive. So this is a way of giving people access to that system where they can just use a rapid antigen test in itself as evidence of COVID. The risk of having symptoms at this time of year is very low from other respiratory infections. So in fact, you know, our whole background prior probability, if you like, is different now. If you live with someone who's got COVID and you've got symptoms, you've got COVID. You don't really need a test. But if you need to take sick leave or you need evidence it's COVID, being able to do it with a rapid antigen test, not go and stand in a queue, is a good thing. So I don't think everyone's going to report, but those where there's, you know, obviously an advantage or they're worried about their own health, absolutely, you know, we're hoping they will report so that they're captured and supported by the system.
But you don't think everyone will. What do you make of that move announced out of National Cabinet yesterday? You just conceded that the rapid antigen tests, as people have been saying for a long time, have never been regarded as accurate as a PCR test. That's why we always used to have to get a PCR test to confirm it. Now, National Cabinet has removed that requirement. You don't need a PCR test to confirm a rat test anymore. It seems to be suddenly, for one reason or another, because perhaps there's too many people going to get PCR tested, that we've removed that requirement. Are we doing these for the right reasons?
Well, rapid antigen test actually works better in a higher incidence population. So as this prior probability of having the virus goes up, because there's a lot of virus now spreading in most of our bigger cities, that means that a positive test is more informative in a way. So that's part of the reason they didn't approve them previously, because in fact you could get more false positives than real positives if the risk was actually very low. That's changed. So it makes rapid antigen testing work differently in the home. You know, this is not talking about point of care testing where it's done by a medical or a healthcare worker. This is actually, you know, people testing themselves in the house. But now people as I said, in particular settings, you're a household contact of a case. You want to monitor whether you might have picked up the virus. You have to quarantine anyway, so it doesn't change that. But if you want to monitor, so they say, well, I've got it now, we can just hang out in the house together, I don't have to try and isolate from you, then a rapid antigen test is all you need to do that. And if you do more than one test, even if you miss it the first time, might only pick up 60% of people who are positive. If you're retesting the next day or the day after, and you are really positive, it'll pick it up then. But it just gives you a way of screening in the house.
Yep, as long as you've got enough tests to go around. All right, now further north, the Northern Territory's introduced movement restrictions for unvaccinated adults. They're only allowed to leave their homes for medical treatment, getting essential goods and services and providing care. What do you make of that move?
It's interesting. I think we're seeing as different states and territories have a very different experience in terms of living with the virus to date. You know, obviously New South Wales and Victoria are much further along the path to adapting everything, the way we focus our contact tracing and the way we look at public safety measures in the community. In the Northern Territory, they've got different challenges to other states. Obviously, they've got the remote communities. They've also got more challenges in terms of getting testing done, particularly genomic testing and knowing which variants are circulating. So while, you know, in the East Coast, if we know that predominantly it's Omicron's spreading, then actually vaccination status isn't going to make a big deal, and people hopefully are less likely to be seriously ill even if they're unvaccinated. But in the Territory, slightly different story. They're still really worried about what being infected with Omicron might mean if you're fully not vaccinated and haven't had prior infection. And most people in the Territory haven't had infection. Very different sort of acquired immunity picture there altogether, and they're trying to protect remote communities. So it's only for 4 days to take them through to Monday so they can assess the situation and then plan what they do from here.
All right.
But at this stage, it's, just trying to slow it down a bit.
The National Cabinet also decided, as the Prime Minister said, that schools should go back and stay back on day one of term one. What measures need to be in place to make sure that students and teachers remain safe so we don't see an explosion in a number of cases when students return to school? Some might have had their first dose, but hardly any will have had their second.
Yeah, a lot of people have been putting a lot of work into this over the months. In fact, there were various plans in place last year coming out of lockdown as well. So they'll have been looked at again in light of Omicron. What we're likely to see is, again, rapid antigen tests really having a place there too. Not just, as we saw in the Doherty modelling, they were suggesting if you have an exposure, test kids, and if they're negative, they can stay, but get them to test each day. If they're close contacts of a case, you might get those kids to wear masks if it's not a requirement in the school. But when you have really high incidence in the community, it's also wise to do some screening. So you don't wait till you've had a lab confirmed case be notified to the school of someone who's been in school for 3 or 4 days. You actively screen your teachers, other staff and students. Not all of them. You might only do it twice a week. It might be a random selection, but just to try and keep an eye on the safety of the school community. If you find someone's positive, you can react more quickly and you've got less chance that the virus has already spread, even if you've got low vaccination rates in that class level.
Yep.
Or it's Omicron and the kids won't be fully protected against it. You can contain it by using that screening process.
Need to have those tests at hand. I can't let you go without addressing the Djokovic question. Is it reasonable that Australia stops unvaccinated people, that we assume he may well be, from entering the country?
Well, we allow them to enter as long as they go through quarantine. So that's the choice. You either, choose to be vaccinated or not, and you can still enter the country, but you are required to go through that 14-day quarantine process. So that, to me, is kind of the issue here. He could have actually come earlier and had the quarantine, but in fact, if he doesn't meet the exemption requirements, then you can't sort of have one rule for one, as we know. It's got to be a consistent message, and we still have our border rules based on quarantine in relation to vaccination status for good reason. The only virus in the world is not Omicron. We are still dealing mainly in our hospitals with people hospitalised with COVID, for COVID infections. It's Delta, and so we still need to manage that and not have other variants causing problems in our community. So vaccination's an important requirement at our border. We have to make it that consistent requirement across the board.
And briefly, how do you think it's playing in Victoria? How's the community scoring this?
The whole decision's been quite interesting. I think there was an absolute reaction. Again, we're so concerned about consistent messaging in public health, but that was the the call out from the community as well. You know, you can't have something that suddenly looks odd and wouldn't apply to other people. And so there was a real backlash about that. And I think there's really strong support. I think when the Prime Minister came out yesterday and spoke very strongly about one rule fits all, and then that was backed up when the process stood up today, when that was put through to the border control. I think that was received really well by the community. That's what they wanted to see.
Let's see what the legal challenge brings. It may not be over yet. Catherine, thank you very much. Professor Catherine Bennett, the Chair of Epidemiology at Deakin University. Let's get more on that Djokovic story. The Minister for Home Affairs, Karen Andrews, is defending Border Force's decision to stop the tennis great from entering the country. Novak Djokovic, the male world number one's visa was cancelled last night when he arrived in Australia because he allegedly failed to meet the country's entry requirements. The Serb is now in an immigration hotel that has launched a court challenge against his detention and the cancellation of his visa. Ms Andrews says Border Force did act appropriately.
Clearly, Border Force before them had a series of issues that they need to deal with. They understand very clearly what is required for entry into Australia. That is a valid visa, and then there are specific entry requirements that apply at this point in time. That includes the PCR negative test 3 days before uplift. It includes the completion of an Australia travel declaration, and it includes the requirement for the traveller to be fully vaccinated. But if they're not fully vaccinated, the traveller has to provide an acceptable proof that says very clearly that they cannot be vaccinated because of medical reasons. That is the information that Border Force looks for. So if that information is not forthcoming, if it's not available, then Border Force is in the position of determining that that individual does not meet the requirements for entry to Australia. So that is the action that I have been clearly advised that Border Force took last night. That is the appropriate action that they need to be taking. Our position is very clear. And we have set out very clearly what the requirements are to enter Australia. And I understand that there's a lot of confusion out there, and there's a lot of views that are being put forward in relation to the visa. That is absolutely a Commonwealth responsibility. But it is a very separate process to the entry requirements to come into Australia. So first step in the process is a valid visa. Once a traveller has a valid visa, then they have to comply with specific entry requirements. And I've gone through what those are. So it's two processes that have to be gone through.
That's the Home Affairs Minister, Karen Andrews, backing up the actions of the Border Force officers at Tullamarine Airport last night in Melbourne, speaking there on ABC Radio Melbourne. All right, let's talk some actual sport on the field now. Brianna Holden's back, and it looks like Australia has a new all-rounder. His name's Mitchell Starc. He's hanging in there with Usman Khawaja, Brie.
That certainly seems to be the case. Australia are currently 7 for 384 on day 2 of the 4th Ashes Test at the SCG. Usman Khawaja has made a triumphant return to the Test side with a ton. He's currently on 132. That's after he was initially not selected for the series with Travis Head picked over him. Head is out, though, after testing positive to COVID-19. Mitchell Starc, meanwhile, is on 23. And Stuart Broad, he's having a decent innings. He's currently got 4 wickets to his name. Looking at the other story of the day, Novak Djokovic, of course, a court challenge against the detention of the tennis star has again been adjourned until 6 o'clock tonight. His lawyers launched a last-minute bid in the Federal Circuit Court this afternoon to oppose the federal government's decision to deport Djokovic from Australia. It comes after his visa was cancelled when he arrived in Melbourne. And Federal Minister Greg Hunt has told ABC Radio Melbourne Border Force reviewed all material provided by Djokovic, and neither he nor the Victorian government could provide sufficient evidence to meet the requirements to enter Australia.
One rule for all. We've been very clear, very strong on that.
Australians in so many cases have to show their own vaccination status in order to enter cafes or other things. It's not unreasonable that other people have to provide equivalent evidence.
Looking at the rest of the day's sport, and the Women's Ashes cricket series will take a start a week earlier to allow Australian and England teams to complete a 10-day quarantine in New Zealand before the World Cup in March. The Ashes will start on January 20 with the first of 3 T20 internationals at the Adelaide Oval. The Test match will keep its original start date of January 27 in Canberra, and the Ashes series will then finish with 3 one-day internationals to be played in both Canberra and Melbourne. And looking at the BBL, veteran bowler Peter Siddle has helped the Adelaide Strikers to end their 6-game losing streak. The last-place Strikers beat Hobart by 7 wickets at Adelaide Oval last night. Siddle returned figures of 5 for 23 as the home side bowled the Hurricanes out for 126, with opener Matt Short remaining unbeaten on 72. The Strikers had nearly 5 overs to spare when they hit the winning runs. Meanwhile, South Africa needs another 122 runs to win the second test against India at the Wanderers. The home side will resume on the 4th day at 2 for 118 in its second innings, chasing 240 to win the match and tie the series. South African captain Dean Elgar is unbeaten on 46, scoring his runs patiently off 121 balls. Looking at the Adelaide International Tennis Tournament, an Australian wildcard, Priscilla Hon, has been knocked out, going down in straight sets to Belarusian Victoria Azarenka 6-3, 7-5 a short time ago. Meanwhile, Ash Barty and Storm Sanders' double quarterfinal against Erin Rutliff and Leylah Fernandez has seen them through to the semi-finals. An earlier Polish number 5 seed Iga Swiatek defeated Leylah Fernandez in their round of 16 singles rubber 6-1, 6-2. And in the men's, Australian tennis player Thanasi Kokkinakis has upset world number 38 Francis Tiafoe to reach the quarterfinals. The 25-year-old fought back from a set down to win 3-6, 7-5, 6-1 in his hometown event. To MMA now, and UFC featherweight champion Alexander Volkanovski will fight former champion Max Holloway in a trilogy bout as the Australian looks to defend his title for a third time. Wollongong-based Volkanovski originally defeated Holloway in 2019 to clinch the title before defending against the American 6 months later, and more recently against Brian Ortega in September last year. Holloway is widely considered the sport's greatest featherweight champion. And Glenn, an interesting thing about that is I've never heard of a trilogy being set up once one fighter has already won the first 2 bouts. So a few people are questioning whether that is a legitimate trilogy.
Double or nothing. All right, thank you very much. That's Bree Holden with the news of sport. The news in finance isn't good today. The Australian share market has lost 207 points, 2.75% to 7,358 after the falls on Wall Street. The contagions hit Japan as well. The Nikkei has lost 844 points, about 2.9%. The dollar's down too to 71.7 US cents. Friday's forecast, and in Brisbane expect more showers, 23 to 27 degrees, and Sydney the same, a shower or two, 23 to 28 tomorrow. Canberra, 17 rising to 25, and showers or storms possibly heavy in the capital tomorrow. Maybe a storm in Melbourne too, another humid day, 21 rising to a top of 29. Hobart, 17 to 25, a rainy day with the chance of a storm. Showers in Adelaide again as well, 16 to 23. Perth, the same story, very hot and sunny, down to 20 overnight and then up to 38 degrees again in Perth tomorrow. Warmer than Darwin, tomorrow 27 to 34 for you. It should be partly cloudy on Friday. Exactly 5:30 Eastern Daylight Time, so that's 5 o'clock in South Australia and 4:30 Queensland time. If you're with us in the Northern Territory, it's 4 p.m. and 2:30 now in Western Australia. Time for us to get all the latest news headlines, courtesy of Clive Hunton.
Glenn, these are the stories we're chasing this hour. There's that hearing, of course, in the Federal Circuit Court in Melbourne to decide whether Novak Djokovic can stay in Australia. That hearing resuming in about half an hour. Lawyers for Djokovic saying they've been advised Tennis Australia needs a definitive answer by Tuesday for scheduling purposes. But Judge Anthony Kelly giving them short shrift, saying the tail won't be wagging the dog here. On the COVID situation, the Northern Territory enters a lockout after 256 new COVID cases were detected. Under that lockout, unvaccinated people will only be allowed to leave their homes for medical treatment or getting essential goods and services and providing care for someone who can't care for themselves. The ACT, meanwhile, recording 992 new cases. That's the highest daily number since the pandemic began. New South Wales police are on the scene of a deadly shooting in Sydney. The brother of gang leader Bassem Hamzy has been shot dead in what police have described as a targeted attack. Obviously a history there. The death following the fatal shootings of his brother Majid Hamzy in 2020 and cousin Bilal Hamzy in Sydney's city centre last year. The Australian Stock Exchange suffering heavy falls today, led down by tech stocks. The ASX down 2.5%. And one other story we're keeping tabs on, people are fleeing their homes in Vanuatu after the government declared a danger zone around an active volcano. The Manaro Vui volcano is a well-known tourist site, but over the past 2 months, ash plumes have destroyed crops and contaminated water supplies. Locals telling us drinkable water is becoming a serious issue. More from me in half an hour.
All right, Clive, thank you very much.
You're listening to ABC News Radio.
And on the way, record COVID numbers in New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland. Retail groups say the shortages of fresh food on the supermarkets should only be a temporary thing. And the push to save the native flora and fauna of Norfolk Island. To Queensland, first of all, where the Chief Health Officer, John Gerrard, says all Queenslanders can expect to be exposed to COVID-19 within weeks as the latest outbreak peaks. The state's recorded 10,332 new cases today. 284 people are in hospital, 12 of them in intensive care. One death was also recorded. That's a man in his 80s who died last week. From Brisbane, here's Melinda Howells.
Despite those changes announced at National Cabinet yesterday, we still saw people lining up before dawn this morning in their cars or on foot to try to secure a COVID PCR test. And there still is that huge unmet demand here in Queensland. As you said, we know that of those who have been able to get tested, there have been more than 10,000 positive results returned. But our Chief Health Officer says that's a gross underestimation, given that there are so many people who haven't been able to receive a test or who've tested positive on a rapid antigen test, which of course is not currently being recorded anywhere. On the subject of those tests, Queensland had said this week that it was expecting a delivery of 500,000 rapid tests in the next couple of days, but we've since learned that only 150,000 of those are going to be delivered. So they will be handed out at some of the state-run testing clinics to try to alleviate that pressure, with preference given to people who might need that day 6 test to get out of isolation, people who can't wait in long lines, pregnant women, the elderly, those kinds of groups. But still, obviously, a huge demand for testing. And sadly, also, we need to report today that there has been a COVID-related death in Queensland, a man in his 80s who actually died just after Christmas, but it's only now that the coroner has confirmed that was a COVID-related death.
Tell us what is expected to happen in coming weeks in the state as the virus continues to spread.
Well, the health system is certainly preparing for a huge increase in cases and a flow-on effect into the hospital system. They're expecting that as more and more people test positive, more people will develop a severe illness, particularly older groups of the population. At the moment, a lot of the spread is among younger, healthier people, but that's likely to change. So Chief Health Officer Dr. John Gerrard has described it as preparing for an emergency situation in Queensland hospitals.
The fact that it's very infectious means we're going to see a very large number of people in the next 2 to 3 weeks getting infected and also impacting on our hospitals. That's bad in one sense, but also means that the peak it is likely to end sooner. As speaking as someone who's worked in hospitals, and I'm talking to my colleagues here, I think we are very good at stepping up to an emergency, which is what we are about to see.
So, Kirsten, that includes things like staff being reallocated to the areas of greatest need and possibly some more cancellations of elective surgery to come as Queensland hospitals prepare for that influx of COVID patients.
That's Melinda Howells reporting from Brisbane on the COVID situation there. Further south, the strain on Victoria's health system is showing, with hundreds of healthcare workers testing positive to COVID. The state's seen another jump in hospital admissions and has recorded more than 20,000 new cases. It's prompted a return to some restrictions as well. Amelia Turzon is in Melbourne.
As cases of COVID continue to climb here in Victoria, the government is bringing back density limits in venues such as cafes, restaurants and nightclubs. The changes come into effect from midnight tonight, and they mean that venues can now only have one person per 2 square metres. This will significantly restrict the capacity of some venues. Now, the government has brought in these changes 2 weeks after they were actually recommended by the Chief Medical Officer here in Victoria. They come as case numbers continue to climb. In the last 24 hours, 21 cases of COVID were detected through PCR testing. That was out of 60,000 PCR tests. There has been concerns, however, that not all of the cases out in the community are being detected because there's been changes in PCR testing rules. People have been told to only get a PCR test here if they're symptomatic or if they're a close contact that has symptoms. They've also been told that if they do a rapid test and it comes back positive, they don't have to do a PCR test. Now, in response to these concerns that not enough of the case numbers are actually being recorded in official data, the Victorian government has now said that if you get a positive case of COVID detected through rapid testing, you have to contact the Victorian Health Department and record it with them. They are actually creating a new code in data called probable cases of COVID to help record these cases. And that also means that those people who record positive via rapid tests, they'll be able to access healthcare. Now, the healthcare system, it's still struggling here because of COVID. We've had 40 more people in hospital with COVID in the last 24 hours. We do know that most of the people in hospital, they're sick with the Delta variant, not the Omicron variant, which is now incredibly dominant here in Victoria. And unfortunately, 6 more people have died here from COVID in the last 24 hours. The one silver lining is that 13% of Victorians have now had their booster shots, and as we know, 93% of Victorians have had 2 vaccinations.
Amelia Turzon reporting from Melbourne there. Well, a recent report from researchers in Hong Kong suggests the vaccine Sinovac is less effective against Omicron than other vaccines, even though the World Health Organization says it can help prevent severe illness from the variant. With the Chinese vaccine the most commonly used in China, it's raised questions about the government's ability to stick to its zero coronavirus target as Omicron cases continue to emerge in the country. Dr. Nicholas Thomas is Associate Professor of Health Security in Hong Kong.
The Chinese vaccines, like a lot of other vaccines around the world, seem to be struggling against Omicron. They're definitely providing a degree of protective support for people's immune systems. But when it comes to Omicron, we now have studies from one of our sister universities, as well as in Beijing and Shanghai, that it really doesn't provoke the sort of immune response we need to protect people against Omicron effectively.
Yes, Dr. Thomas, when you look at, the current concerns around Omicron, how quickly it spreads, what is the advice that is best placed to keep infections at bay at this point?
Well, it's the same advice that we've been doing all along, and indeed, in many ways, that we've been following for centuries. Physical and social distancing, improving personal hygiene and ensuring that those hygiene standards are to a good quality, and really limiting your opportunities outside interacting with other people. Now, of course, this is difficult for people because most of us live in cities and we mix with people. We're seeing an outbreak here in Hong Kong on exactly that issue. But really, it's the only thing, keeping ourselves separate and physically, socially distanced, helps prevent the spread of the virus. And that's pretty much where we're up to, as well as maintaining a good health and hopefully having vaccinations as soon as possible.
Yes, Dr. Thomas, you mentioned social distancing there as one of the strategies. Now, looking at China's zero COVID strategy, which has been described as extremely strict, how do you think the Chinese-made vaccines might align with that strategy?
When it comes to Omicron, the reality is that China will be still reliant on its zero COVID strategy. Neither Sinopharm nor Sinovac do give a high degree of support against the Omicron or against the Delta strain, of course, which we're still worried about. So for the time being, at least, we're going to see a continuation of the pattern that we're seeing in Xi'an at the moment and in a couple of other places around China, with a high degree of lockdowns, mass testing, and also mass quarantining of both symptomatic and close contact people.
Dr. Thomas, just looking further afield, a lot of these Chinese-made vaccines have been either donated or bought by developing countries out here in Southeast Asia. How do you see the development of Omicron in light of that, the fact that those vaccines have been used in this part of the world?
Well, there's sort of two tracks there. I mean, we are seeing a surge since December of Omicron in a lot of Southeast Asian countries. But even before that, there was a move by a number of these Southeast Asian countries, Indonesia, Thailand in particular, towards giving the people who'd been double inoculated with Sinopharm or Sinovac with a third booster shot from, for example, Pfizer, so as to help build up people's immune system by mixing the vaccines. So for now, at least, if that strategy is followed and if there's a greater reliance on the mRNA technology in Southeast Asia, which seems to provide a greater degree of protection, then it's going to be pretty much everywhere, like it is everywhere else in the world, relying on social and physical distancing with vaccines. But it is possible to head off the worst of what we're seeing elsewhere.
Dr. Nicholas Thomas, Associate Professor of Health Security at City University in Hong Kong, speaking to the BBC's Karishma Vaswani. Let's come back home. The National Retail Association is urging shoppers not to panic buy. Coles and Woolworths have both reported shortages of fresh food at some stores, and trucking associations have been saying for some time there are systemic blockages in our logistics networks. Retail Association CEO Dominic Lamb says while supermarket shelves are looking a bit bare, the Australian food supply is sound.
Look, when we look across the country, obviously we are starting to see those bare shelves again, particularly in some of our supermarkets and certainly around items like meats, for instance, or toilet paper, amongst other things that we've seen shortages of before. And I guess, when it comes to supply, there's a few things that are compounding at this time. And one of those things includes issues around pallets, amongst other things around the country. But of course, our supermarkets are very well versed in all of these things, and we're very much assured that our food supply is sound and people shouldn't panic.
So are you seeing examples of panic buying starting again?
We're certainly seeing them with items that are hard to get. So things like rat tests, for instance, we know that people are obviously hunting them down. There are websites that have been created in order to locate them, and people are certainly searching them out and trying to purchase them in mass. We know that limits have now been put on things like that as well. Of course, we are seeing some panic buying around some of those normal items that we have seen before, because we do have quite a few people in quarantine at this time as well across the country. And people are simply bunkering down again. So look, we just need to call for calm and obviously get people to, make some smart decisions and just understand that, supply will be there. We might just need to wait for a few days, but not to be alarmed by those vacant shelves.
Now, Coles has put out that they are going to limit how much meat people can buy of certain items. Are you seeing that in any other supermarkets as well?
Look, we normally see where the major retail chain starts to limit those products that you will see it across a number of the major retail chains. This time we haven't seen the others come out with announcements, but I would suspect that that's likely to happen shortly. We know that for many of our independents, those limits are unlikely to be put on. And we also know that consumers will move back to their local stores just simply with the increase in numbers of COVID-19 in the community. We know that they will start to shop locally.
How long are you expecting this to go on? And do you think it'll be quite a short thing that after a couple of weeks will settle down, or is this going to be a long-term issue?
Look, at this time, we would imagine this will be short-lived. This is something that our grocery chains are, very well versed in and, are very good at managing their supply. So we anticipate that, all of these things will be short-lived and that, consumers will go back to normal as soon as possible.
What would your main message to consumers be?
Look, our main message to consumers is to simply make, calm decisions, know that there is going to be supply and not to be concerned.
That's a Retail Association Chief Executive Dominic Lamb. She was speaking there to Megan Hughes. But 4:45 Eastern Daylight Time. South Australia is now at 5:15 and it's 4:45 Queensland time. Northern Territory at 4:15. It's 2:45 in Western Australia. Making headlines, the Prime Minister has denied tennis champion Novak Djokovic was singled out over his vaccination status, saying he was unable to prove he was medically exempt from being vaccinated against COVID-19. The world number one was barred from entering Australia after Border Force determined he didn't meet the entry requirements for a visa. A court challenge has since been launched in the Federal Circuit and Family Court. The Northern Territory government has reintroduced territory-wide restrictions until Monday after recording 256 new COVID infections. Under the lockout, unvaccinated people will only be allowed to leave their homes for 3 reasons: medical treatment, getting essential goods and services, and providing care. And the Victorian government's announced major changes to its COVID testing system in a bid to ease pressure on pathology centres. From tomorrow, those who test positive on a rapid antigen test must report the results by phone or online to the Health Department. And another brother of gang leader Bassam Hamzi has been shot dead in Sydney's west. Just some of the stories making news this Thursday. Norfolk Island has embarked on a mission to eliminate all invasive species on the island and restore it to as close to its pre-settlement state as possible. It comes after the release of digital maps which show the changes in vegetation from 1750 to now. They're getting rid of everything from feral cats to weeds, which are taking over from some endangered native species that exist nowhere else in the world. The project's been made possible by a philanthropic grant from the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation in Melbourne. Naomi Christian is a botanist and descendant of one of the original Norfolk Island families, and she spoke earlier to News Radio Scott Wales.
It's a project that is very close to my heart. I wanted to regenerate some of my husband's family land on Norfolk Island, and when I filled out the grant application for a federal grant, environmental grant, I was able to justify the grant application because we had so many threatened species on the block of land, but there was no vegetation mapping, and that was part of the criteria I had to meet in order to satisfy the grant application. And so that initial vegetation mapping is something that Norfolk Island landholders need if they're going to compete with other people in mainland Australia in order to justify grant applications. And it's also a really important tool for conservation planning. So if you're looking at a great big area of land, not that Norfolk's particularly large, but if you're looking at the whole of Norfolk Island, what you want to know is where are you going to get the most bang for your conservation buck. So you want to know where the priority areas are. And in order to do that, you really need to start off with this baseline data, this vegetation mapping that shows people where the really good, clean, native vegetation is and where the more weedy stuff is.
And in terms of vegetation, the flora of the island, are there certain species that are quite unique?
Oh, yes. One of the really interesting things about isolated oceanic islands like Norfolk Island is that whilst we tend to have fewer actual plant species than a comparable area of a mainland landmass, for example, Australia, we will have a much higher proportion of endemic species. So that means about a quarter of the plant species on Norfolk Island are found nowhere else on the planet. So they are only found on Norfolk Island. And that means not only are they very special, but they're more likely to go extinct because of clearing and habitat loss and what have you. So, yes, the answer is there are many, many plants that could benefit from this mapping and from further conservation works.
And are we talking about animals as well as plants, or is this primarily about a vegetation project?
Scott, I have to admit I'm a botanist, so I'm
Sure.
a bit biased. And I will talk mainly about the plants. But yes, there are birds and, for example, there were once bats on Norfolk Island, and many of our native birds are endemic to Norfolk, so they're only found on Norfolk, and some are already extinct. So yes, it does cover both flora and fauna.
And how serious is the threat from invasive species, and what sort of invasive species in terms of the plants are we talking about that threaten the endemic vegetation on the island?
Well, the mapping that we prepared, we mapped the extent of current native vegetation communities, and that's a 2020 dated map. And then we went all the way back to 1750. And if you have a look at the difference between those two maps, you can see that back in 1750, most of the island was covered by native vegetation, and now only a very small area of the island is covered by native vegetation communities. That's not only due to invasive species coming in. It is due, of course, to clearing for housing and for agriculture and for various other activities that are essential. But it is also due to weeds, particularly, for example, woody weeds on Norfolk. Shynus terebinthifolius, which we call locally Hawaiian holly, or Australian people might know it as pepper tree, is probably the worst weed on Norfolk at the moment. That's a weed that has the ability to take over cleared land, and it can also invade the edges of intact forest. And we have a number of other weeds, such as strawberry guava. Locally, we call it paw-pear in Norfolk. That's a weed that can actually invade quite intact forests. So the threat is real. We have volunteer groups that work to remove those weeds from reserves and private land, and the Norfolk Island National Park is doing a magnificent job of reducing the amount of weeds across their park.
Is the aim of this to preserve what's existing there in terms of that endemic vegetation, or to expand that habitat to some extent on the island over time?
So the vegetation mapping project, which I was involved in together with Dr. Kevin Mills, the aim of that project was to get a snapshot of what is currently on Norfolk Island, and we had to, first of all, identify the 14 different types of vegetation communities that are actually present. So they're not just forests, for example. There are native swamps, there are native coastal grasslands and other types of vegetation communities. We needed to know what was present now and what was present before, so that people who are, for example, restoring their land know what to replant. Also, to help people prioritise where the really good areas are, so that they can start in those good areas and work outwards from there. So part of the mapping included condition scoring of the various forest and grassland and swamp types that we surveyed.
Finally, Naomi, as a descendant of one of the original families of the island, I suppose this project is in one sense about your work, about science, but it also has a fairly personal angle as well.
Yes, this is something that is very close to my heart. Growing up on Norfolk, I spent countless hours in the National Park learning different plant names from older Norfolk Islanders. I hope they don't mind if they're listening, who are really keen to share their knowledge. And plant knowledge on Norfolk is actually part of our story, I suppose, because if you think back to, I'm a descendant of Fletcher Christian and his Tahitian wife, Mahotua. And when the original mutiny on the Bounty took place and they ended up on Pitcairn Island, plant knowledge was essential for those people to actually survive. The Tahitian women knew so many things about how to use coconuts, how to use Cypress lucidus or ma'u and those kinds of things. And the English sailors also knew a lot. And I guess that kind of knowledge still is held within our community, and it's still there today. So, yes, it's very close to my heart, but it's also part of Norfolk Island's cultural history.
Norfolk Island botanist Naomi Christian with Scott Wales. To sport, and Brianna Holden.
On day 2 of the 4th Ashes Test at the SCG, Australia are 8 for 399 or 400. Now, Usman Khawaja fell for 137 a short while ago, while Mitchell Starc is currently on 33 and Nathan Lyon is waiting for his first run, while Stuart Broad has 5 wickets. Meanwhile, Novak Djokovic's ability to enter Australia remains unknown after Border Force said he failed to meet the country's entry requirements. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, says Border Force did its job, but former Australian Open tournament director Paul McNamee says the decision taken is not that clear-cut.
This is the only player that I have ever known in the history of the Australian Open that has had his visa rescinded. Remember, he applied and had his visa approved only for it to be rescinded at the airport. Now, when that happens at other tournaments around the world, there are massive consequences for that because the players need to know with confidence that if they're going to fly around the world to a tournament and their visa has been approved, that they're not going to have this problem at entry. So clearly there's a left-hand, right-hand problem between what the federal government and state government believe. And, it's been a problem we've seen for the last 2 years in Australia, and now the victim of that is the number 1 player in the world.
Tennis Australia and the Victorian Government gave a joint press conference yesterday explaining that Novak Djokovic was among a number of players who had been granted medical exemptions ahead of the tournament. Where does the problem lie? Have you been able to work out exactly whether there has been a disconnect between the organisation that's gone on in Victoria and the federal government that has seemingly worked in the past, or where has the problem actually occurred?
Well, there's obviously we have to understand what the technicalities are, but every player and support member of a player fills in a Form 408. It's a Visa 408. Everybody does that. You're guided through it by Tennis Australia every step of the way, and then you get approval. That's the process. Now, when you're talking about the vaccination issue and the exemption issue, Novak Djokovic, he rolled the dice on that. I mean, it's clear he chose not to be vaccinated. That's clear. And rolled his dice whether an exemption would be approved. He received that at the last minute. If he didn't get that exemption, he was not coming to Australia. He was following the rules. Now, you might be angry that he was given an exemption, but players need to have confidence that the rules that they abide by are going to be enforced. So if this is something to do with the vaccination and the exemption, for me, that's not fair. That's not fair. The guy played by the rules. He got his visa. He arrives. He's a 9-time champion. Whether people like it or not, he's entitled to fair play. And there's no doubt there's some disconnect between the state and the federal government. I've got no doubt about that. And, I hate to think politics are involved, but it feels that way.
And that was former Australian Open tournament director Paul McNamee speaking with Kirsten Aiken. And I will be back with the latest sports news and maybe an update on that Djokovic federal circuit court situation a little bit later on.
Look forward to that. Some strong words from Paul McNamee, and there's a few others flowing online as well. Let's check Rafael Nadal's Twitter account for his reaction. Interesting stuff. Interesting day on the share market today as well. The Australian share market losing 207 points, 2.75%, down to 7,358, our worst day for some time. The Japan market has lost 844 points after the falls on Wall Street. It's all about the threat of rising interest rates in the US. The Federal Market Reserve minutes revealing that they're starting to change tack, and the markets didn't like that. The Aussie dollar 71.6 US cents right now. Time for tomorrow's weather. And it's a bit like today. Brisbane heading for showers and 23 to 27. More showers in Sydney, 23 to 28. And showers or storms in Canberra, maybe heavy at times, 17 rising to 25 in the capital. Checking Melbourne, another humid day with the chance of a storm, 21 to 29. And Hobart, also a possible storm on a rainy day with temperatures of 17 to 25. A shower or two forecast again in Adelaide, 16 to 23. Another very hot and sunny day in Perth, in fact going from 20 to 38 tomorrow. And 27 to 34 in Darwin on Friday. It should be partly cloudy for you. Our news update's coming away at 6 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time, 5:30 in South Australia, 5 o'clock in Queensland, and now 4:30 in the Northern Territory. In Western Australia, it's now exactly 3 o'clock.
ABC News, I'm Clive Hunton. Australia and Japan have signed a landmark defence agreement for closer cooperation between their militaries. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida met in a virtual summit this afternoon. Follows a year of talks between the two governments. Mr Morrison says the treaty will form an important part of both countries' response to uncertainty.
It will underpin greater and more complex engagement, interoperability and cooperation between the Australian Defence Force and the Japanese Self-Defence Forces. We know our relationship is much more and much deeper than just about security issues.
A court challenge against the detention of tennis star Novak Djokovic is resuming in Melbourne about now. His lawyers launched a bid in the Federal Circuit and Family Court this afternoon to oppose the federal government's decision to deport Djokovic from Australia. His visa was cancelled when he arrived in Melbourne. Lawyers for Djokovic claim Tennis Australia needs a definitive answer by Tuesday for Australian Open scheduling purposes. But Judge Anthony Kelly told them the tail won't be wagging the dog here. Sydney police say criminal networks will be investigated following the death of a man in the city's west. Ghassan Amoun was shot on the street this afternoon in South Wentworthville. ABC sources say he was shot several times. Acting Superintendent Glenn Fitzgerald says a burnt-out car was found nearby and is believed to be linked to the targeted attack.
There appears to be a driver and a shooter that got out of one of the vehicles, so at the moment that's the information that we have. It would appear that he was approached as he got into his vehicle.
The dead man is the brother of gang leader Bassam Hamzi. Their brother Mejib Hamzi was shot dead in 2020 and cousin Bilal was killed last year. The Northern Territory has introduced movement restrictions for unvaccinated adults as the government tries to slow growing rates of community transmission. Jesse Thompson has more.
27 of today's record 256 cases are presumed community transmission, but a further 122 are under investigation, and the government says the rising rate of community spread is concerning. The entire Northern Territory is now under a lockout until midday Monday. Fully vaccinated people can carry on as usual, but the unvaccinated aged 16 and over can only leave their homes for medical services, essential goods and to provide care. A vaccine pass system will come in once the lockout lifts. There are 23 people in hospital, 8 of them receiving acute care, including 2 in ICU.
Tasmania has recorded over 750 new cases of COVID, including a super spreader event on King Island. Bailey Kenzie reports.
There are currently 3,524 active cases in Tasmania, with 5 positive cases in hospital. However, only one of those is being treated for COVID-19 symptoms. 237 people have been released from isolation today. Today is the first day in almost 2 years that international travellers have not been required to isolate upon arrival in Tasmania. King Island has processed 109 tests for COVID-19 and returned 30 positive results. Urgent testing for the virus began on the Bass Strait Island after a wedding resulted in a number of positive cases.
West Australians will have to wait to find out whether the COVID-19 mask requirements in place across Perth and the Peel region will be extended. Transport Minister Risa Safioti says they'll make an announcement regarding restrictions tomorrow.
In relation to the mask wearing, that'll be a decision that will be made upon advice from the Chief Health Officer.
Queensland's Department of Education says it's carefully monitoring the COVID situation for schools. More from Emily Gramens.
Children between 5 and 11 years old will be able to receive their first dose of a COVID-19 vaccination from next Monday. It's recommended that cohort wait 8 weeks for their second dose, meaning most won't be fully vaccinated when school resumes at the end of January. The Australian Primary Principals Association says having adequate access to rapid antigen tests will be key to classrooms running smoothly. Queensland's Education Department says it's using the summer break to update its extensive planning and that parents and school communities will be kept informed.
2 people trapped in a car are reportedly teetering on the edge of a cliff in the Grampians National Park in Victoria's West. It's understood the 4-wheel drive ran off a dangerous off-track road near the Zumsteins area this afternoon. And on the second day of the Ashes test at the SCG, Australia now 8 for 416 after losing century maker Usman Khawaja. And that's ABC News.
You're listening to ABC News Radio.
Hello, Laura Chilingirian here with you for the next few hours on this Thursday, the 6th of January. Coming up, Victoria reintroduces density limits and moves to require COVID-positive rapid tests be reported. The top end locks down unvaccinated Territorians until Monday. And how the pandemic is playing havoc with supermarket deliveries. Well, the Victorian government has announced major changes to its COVID testing system in a bid to ease pressure off the state's pathology centres. From tomorrow, those who test positive on a rapid antigen test must report the results by phone or online to the health department. It means people will know its official numbers.
A national decision. We should do this.
Plan for how we'd be using rapid antigen.
Sure why we never ever learn from what's happening
at home. Maybe some
from COVID.
There and some reliance on
the rapid. There's already a PCR.
In many cases,
I think it's positive.
Holders.
Chancellor status.
Biostat now in hospital allowed to list them will be
explained problem. Conversion rate are case at a conversion. That is what locking past into each of these decisions. Down rules will coming ill, including care of the family. 4 days and plenty of time becoming serious with the terror.
NT Clumsy has comments from Australia.
Powers being
happened
more
cold sample.
Lucky with his day.
Well, the brothers report
a car with a millimetre police looked to try to sign on down thing and war thing, but last year community.
Well, was finished was 18 for late nationals with says she's
at court at thrill with the detained.
Brink of
actually hit
club still England quick him so
this tomorrow low of 20 right 17 in a half.
Hello, welcome to tell to the 9 and deal against
this was a
and we rules for the world
having just first play
the COVID
guild
with so there's an on to
reportedly on today's national
reports and people
property
staff tension and
the top is for free and after and please is a straight
to be many haven't
anyone contributing
government sources have told the ABC they're looking at travel documents provided by the two individuals who recently entered the country to see if they too meet Australian entry requirements. Australia and Japan have signed a landmark defence agreement for closer cooperation. Follows a year of talks between the two governments, and Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida met in a virtual summit this afternoon.
It will underpin greater and more complex engagement, interoperability and cooperation between the Australian Defence Force and the Japanese Self-Defence Forces. We know our relationship is much more and much deeper than just about security issues.
The Northern Territory has recorded 256 new COVID infections and introduced a territory-wide lockout until Monday. The lockout means people who are not vaccinated will only be able to leave home for 3 essential reasons. They are medical treatment, getting essential goods and services, and providing care for someone who can't care for themselves. Chief Minister Michael Gunner made the announcement.
Work is not a reason to leave the home for the unvaccinated. The Chief Health Officer has also determined that restriction of movement is critical right now and that 1 hour of exercise for the next 4 days is not essential. Remember, these restrictions only apply to those who are not fully vaccinated.
Meanwhile, Michael Gunner says the territory most recent meeting of National Cabinet. The nation's leaders yesterday agreed that a PCR test would no longer be needed to confirm a positive rapid antigen test. The Chief Minister says he's got enough PCR testing capacity, so there's no need. New South Wales has recorded nearly 35,000 new cases, with the Premier foreshadowing a suspension of elective surgery. Chantal Alcuri reports.
Premier Dominic Perrottet told Nine Radio it's likely the state government will suspend elective surgery to help alleviate significant pressure on the health system.
Our number one focus is ensuring we keep people safe, that our hospital system remains strong.
It comes as hospitalisations increased to 1,609, up from 1,491 the previous day. There are now 131 patients in intensive care and another 6 people died. More than 111,000 COVID tests were carried out in the latest reporting period.
South Australia has recorded just over 3,000 COVID-19 cases.
Les professionnels de la culture ont aussi rendez-vous au ministère pour savoir comment ils seront accompagnés financièrement avec la fréquentation en baisse ou les jauges imposées pour les concerts. Aussi aux variants Omicron, l'Italie décide de rendre le vaccin obligatoire à tous les plus de 50 ans dans l'Union européenne